Thank you to everyone who has decided to join. My name is Varoon. I wanted to talk today about the democratic consequences of data-driven politics. We hear a lot about data-driven politics, about using big data for the sake of politics. There's been a lot of work done in this area. A lot of researchers, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, that have kind of joined the research community, studied this topic in terms of the role of personal data, as to the role of misinformation and disinformation. And I just wanted to jump into the motivation for this talk. Why bother with studying how personal data is being used for political purposes? There are a lot of causes to care about in the world. There are a lot of issues that warrant our attention. Why this one? And I think that this is one that often gets overlooked. It's often one that, in my opinion, is misinterpreted in some ways. And so before talking a little bit about what the democratic consequences of these technologies are, I first thought it'd be helpful to just do a very, very brief overview of some of the technologies that we're talking about, just so you have some context as to when we talk about data-driven politics, what do we mean? So this is by no means exhaustive, and as the last slide kind of just suggested, we've done work in many different parts of the world, and I just want to give a very lightweight preview of some of the technologies that we're talking about. So one of the main technologies that's used in many parts of the world is A/B testing. This is basically just another way of running an experiment. And here, political campaigns and political actors are interested in A/B testing to understand what voters respond to. What you see here are 3 ads that show Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the title of the ads are the same. The images are absolutely the same. The text below the image is the same. However, the text in the image is different. And so this is a clear example of the organization that sponsored this campaign very likely running an experiment. And here the experiment could be something as how many people end up clicking sign up from these different ads. Does one of these ads attract more signups or more email addresses or more volunteers or more donors than the other? It's a pretty simple concept, and it's really used everywhere. This is another example from the 2012 re-election campaign for Barack Obama in the United States when he was running for president. The details are a bit difficult to see here, but the point is pretty much the same. You have on the left the control. This was basically the default version of the donation page that they were using. And you have on the right the experimental variant that the campaign was testing. And the question here was just pretty simple. Does one of these user flows bring in more donations? And it turns out the user flow on the right brought in 5% more. That might sound like a small amount, but if you imagine 1 million people, I don't know, contributing an average of $5, let's say, a 5% increase is actually quite dramatic. In fact, when you're talking about the scales of users that you can reach on the internet, small changes like this can translate to very large differences in outcomes. So you see here, it's really quite a simple idea, but quite markedly different results. I thought, it would be silly to talk about A/B testing and understanding what voters are responding to without showing an ad from Donald Trump. In some ways, he is the A/B tester in chief. I want to just read this quote from his campaign, from his director of digital campaigning. If I can get my screen to minimize this little bit on the right, I'm not sure if I can get this to minimize to read the quote to you, but on any given day, Kobe said the campaign was running 40,000 to 50,000 variants of the ads. And on the day of the third presidential debate, they ran over 175,000 variants. And Kobe called this A/B testing on steroids. So Gary Kobe was the director of digital campaigning for the Trump 2016 presidential campaign. And here you can see, in this case, they were just testing 2 different images. It turned out that the image on the top, the one outlined in green, performed better than the image on the bottom. There are a few reasons why I want to mention this, because I think, for reference, I used to run an A/B testing team at a tech company in Silicon Valley, and certainly testing of this scale is totally unprecedented. 40,000 to 50,000 variants, and on the night of the third presidential debate, running 175,000 variants. That's absolutely massive. I think the reason why technology like this matters and why it should matter to stakeholders like ourselves who are interested in preserving democratic ideals is that when you're A/B testing on such a massive scale and trying to understand what voters are responding to, you are really able to do a few things. One is to show particular kinds of people particular messages, so you can micro-target very effectively when you have so many different variants of an ad running. But even more importantly, concept here of electing a democratic leader is about, one, electing someone who represents your values, who represents your stance on difficult issues. And I think when A/B testing at the scale is occurring so massively, candidates have an opportunity to shy away from taking a bold political stance. Instead of sharing with the world what they feel on a politically sensitive issue or what their stance is on a controversial matter, they can simply A/B test their way into understanding what people want to hear. You can take any political issue of your choice and you can imagine how you can generate different taglines or headlines or messages about it by observing which messages attract the most buzz or attention among voters. You can end up crafting your own political position in that way. So that's just one technology. A/B testing is one of many. We document 14 or 15 different technologies in the book. This is just one of them, and I thought I'd just mention it, partly because it's used so extensively around the world, and because this one, unlike some other technologies, this is very measurable. You can see, does the banner A or does banner B actually garner more clicks? Another topic I want to talk about, another technology, is about what voters do online. And this is another term for third-party tracking. The ad-based infrastructure of the internet has meant that there is a whole structure of third-party technologies on our websites. So often when you go to one website, choose, for example, your favorite media outlet, it's very, very likely that it's not just that media outlet that knows that here's this user with this IP address, perhaps with other information that's visiting our website. It's very likely that other entities, other companies, third parties that are not that website you visited can also register your visit to that website. And I want to show here this leaked slide from a political campaigning firm in the US, Campaign Grid, that shows that the headline of the slide was "Internet users are no longer anonymous." So here on the left, we see this comic of these two dogs saying, on the internet, no one knows your dog in 1993, but lo and behold, in 2011, here's a dog on the internet, and the organization running the website knows that this dog lives in the 13th Pennsylvania Congressional District with this zip code. They are primarily Republican voting household. They have a high net worth between the ages of 50 and 54. They've got teenagers in the home, interested in politics. They're looking for a car, and they're planning a vacation in Puerto Rico. And I think this is telling because this infrastructure of collecting data on our activities online is very much something that political actors have started to leverage. So I want to share with the group a video of a company that explains how they use this technology in their own words. So that's what will come up next.
You have a compelling story to tell, but how do you make sure voters hear it? There are the national television commercials, but most of the people that see them have already made up their minds. There's the Post, but in today's Britain, most of that just ends up right in the rubbish. So how do you reach your voters and get them to pay attention? Introducing the Political Cookie by DS Political. No, not that kind of cookie. Let me explain. The cookie is a tiny line of code in our browsers that follows our travels online. Ever visit a website and browse for shoes or a new car, and suddenly you keep seeing ads for shoes and cars wherever you go? That's because websites use cookies to identify what kind of ads you want to see. That's where Political Cookie comes in. It makes sure that registered voters in your constituency can finally see ads with exactly the message the campaign needs them to hear at 1/10 of the cost that you're used to. Let's face it, you don't have the time or money to buy ads on every website that voters might end up visiting. So DS Political will do that work for you. We take cookies and match them with the voter file, so you can only target voters that you want to reach, the ones in your constituency that you can move. Advertising that's more accurate, more efficient, and best of all, more budget-friendly. DS Political, home of the political cookie.
This ad kind of explains in this company's own terms a lot about their logic. It's about reaching the right voters at the right time, doing so in a cost-effective way. You don't want to waste your precious political budget on a voter who's not going to go out to vote. You don't want to waste it. You don't want to waste your money on a voter who is probably going to support an opposition candidate. And cookies, by the way, are one of just several different third-party tracking technologies that exist online. Another technology I want to talk about was what we have generally called digital listening. This is about using information that voters post online to learn political things about them. So I want to show here a screenshot from a company called Crimson Hexagon. It's now been rebranded as Brandwatch. But I thought this one was quite funny. This was not long after Canada legalized weed, and they were trying to understand what parts of Canada were expressing support for it and what parts were not. And so you can see here that Western Canada largely was supporting Canada's decision to legalize weed, whereas Eastern Canada was largely in opposition. But what was interesting about this analysis is that they did it using what people were tweeting on Twitter. And it's very much the case today. I think a lot of people don't realize, but when you share anything online, there are companies out there that will scrape that information and build political profiles based on what you've tweeted. And in a way, it's almost like, well, fair enough. Here are people putting things out in the public domain. Although I don't think that people realize that, you know, if I express a political thought on Twitter, there's going to be a company that collects that information and chooses to use it for an explicitly political purpose. And I think this approach to understanding what people are saying, it's all about, is something that's taken hold in data-driven politics big time. So here's a screenshot from a company called Numi saying, in politics, reputation matters above all. Millions of politically charged conversations are taking place on social media every day. So how do you keep on top of it all? Do you know what the public really thinks about important topics, about you and your political track record? Newbie allows you to gauge at any moment how the public perceives you. And here is an image of a man from 2014. His name is Dr. Ko. He is the mayor of Taipei. And here he is visiting a tattoo parlor. And what's interesting is that his visit to this parlor prompted a social media sensation online. People were tweeting about it, commenting on Facebook about it, big time. His campaign released a YouTube video from his visit to a tattoo parlor. But what's very interesting is that he visited this tattoo parlor not because he wanted to get a tattoo and not because he was interested in learning how to give someone a tattoo. He went because a social media company called Autopolitic made a list of activities for him that would generate buzz online. And the activity that was ranked first on this list was visiting a tattoo parlor and generating buzz among young voters. And here is the homepage of that company, Autopolitic. They're very active in Southeast Asia. And here their homepage says, winning elections with social intelligence. An anecdote like this raises a lot of questions about the authenticity of our political leaders. So I think part of what we mean when we talk about data-driven politics is not just running an experiment, do more people fundraise when we have message A or message B, but also the way data-driven insights can be used to shape actions in the offline world. You can imagine even things as silly as what restaurant to eat at, how people might respond to choosing to go to a fast food chain over a high-end fancy restaurant. And you can also imagine a world in which you can start linking these technologies and you can sort of A/B test in advance what kinds of reactions you could anticipate from voters if a political candidate were to pursue different actions. And of course, I think it was difficult to talk about a topic like this without referencing in some ways the elephant in the room, which I think started a lot of this discussion, which of course is Cambridge Analytica. And so I wanted to share one final example of what we mean when we talk about data-driven politics with a short video of the now disgraced CEO of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, talking about one of the technologies that the campaign used. in the 2016 presidential elections in the United States. So here's that video.
Clearly, demographics and geographics and economics will influence your worldview. But equally important, or probably more important, are psychographics. That is an understanding of your personality, because it's personality that drives behavior, and behavior that obviously influences how you vote. So how is this possible? Well, at Cambridge, we've rolled out a long-form quantitative instrument to probe the underlying traits that inform personality. This is the cutting edge in experimental psychology known as the OCEAN model. OCEAN being an acronym for openness, how open you are to new experiences; conscientiousness, whether you prefer order and habits and planning in your life; extroversion, how social you are; agreeableness, whether you put other people's needs and society and community ahead of yourself; and finally, neuroticism, a measurement of how much you tend to worry. By having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans undertake this survey, we were able to form a model to predict the personality of every single adult in the United States of America. So how does this impact marketing and communications in elections? For a primary, the Second Amendment might be a popular issue amongst the electorate. If you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So, for a highly neurotic and conscientious audience, you're going to need a message that is rational and fear-based or emotionally based. In this case, the threat of a burglary and the insurance policy of a gun is very persuasive. Conversely, for a closed and agreeable audience, these are people who care about tradition and habits and family and community. This could be the grandfather who taught his son to shoot and the father who will in turn teach his son. Obviously, talking about these values is going to be much more effective in communicating your message.
I just wanted to give a brief smattering of some of these technologies and briefly address some of the main questions that arise when people first learn about these techniques. And one of them is, does it work? Do these technologies work? Can you really psychometrically profile someone to get them to vote the way you want them to vote? Or is it the fact that you can show people ads to persuade them politically? And I think for me, this is a very understandable question to ask, but it's really a side question in a lot of ways, because in summary, I guess I'll say this briefly to answer the question. I think the effectiveness of these technologies varies. I think in general, they probably don't work as well as the companies who make them want us to believe they work. In some cases, however, like in A/B testing, they're directly measurable. So this question of does it work doesn't totally apply, because you can test whether message A is more effective than message B, depending on what your definition of effectiveness is. But for me, the reason this question of does it work doesn't matter as much is because whether or not a technology works, I think for me is secondary to demonstrating what the use of these technologies reveals about the people using them, what it reveals about their political intentions. You know, for me, it's one thing to ask Cambridge Analytica, does psychometric profiling of voters work? I think a better question is, what does the use of psychometric profiling reveal about political actors who are willing to build personality profiles of every single voter in an attempt to shape their vote? So I think for me, the question of does it work is secondary. It's more a matter of intention. And another big question that my colleagues and I often get when people learn about these technologies is, what's the next big scandal? What's the next big Cambridge Analytica? I thought that this would also be a good thing to address, because in many ways, the point is that these technologies are now so embedded in our experiences with the internet. And so I thought I'd share a few quotes from Edward Snowden's book, Permanent Record, which I think very much capture the way I feel about existence of data-driven political tactics, in the way that he was discussing revelations about, obviously, the work that he was passed and whistleblowed about the extensiveness of the US surveillance operation. So he said, in mid-2012, I was just trying to get a handle on how mass surveillance actually worked. Almost every journalist who later reported on disclosures was primarily concerned with the targets of surveillance. That is to say, they were more interested in the topics of surveillance reports than in the system that produced them. And I think similarly here, when it comes to data-driven politics, it's less about these individuals are enlisting technology A to psychometrically profile this particular set of swing voters who could sway the election, but it's much more about the infrastructure. It's much more about how the system of tracking and collecting data is becoming part of the political calculus, is becoming part of the way political decisions are being made. He later wrote, I knew at least two things about the denizens, another word for occupants. I knew at least two things about the occupants of the fourth estate, which is journalism. They competed for scoops and they knew very little about technology. I think anyone can learn more about technology. I think that's less, for me, that's less compelling an argument, but more about the idea of competing for scoops. Here, again, the scoop is not some, I think often there is this preoccupation with what is the new headline, but I think in some ways the story here is in the boring details of this infrastructure that's become so embedded. So just having touched on some of those technologies themselves, I just want to fly through very briefly some of my thoughts about why this matters for our democracies. And in some ways, why it's actually even worth our time to think about these things, and why I have spent the last 3 years of my life thinking about these things. I think one of the first points is that these sorts of digital technologies have come to reinforce traditional power structures. I think originally in their inception, they were about empowering alternative power structures. In fact, there's a company based in Washington, D.C. that I believe in the 80s was trying to start a political campaign. And back at that time, access to the voter file, this was just a list of voters in a particular district, was cost prohibitive. It was just way too expensive. And so the individuals who end up starting this company called Aristotle thought, well, we should democratize access to this kind of data. It should be available to everyone. You shouldn't need a lot of money to start a political campaign, which is where this movement started from. But I think this movement started originally as a way fighting power structures, but has now come to reinforce and in many ways embody those traditional power structures themselves. This community of startups that are involved with politics, they are no longer a fringe startup sector fighting an uphill battle. They've in fact become the establishment in some ways. And I think you see this with digital ads as well. Originally, social media was a way of circumventing expensive ads on television, but now social media has come to kind of be the locus of digital and political communication. I think that this is relevant because in states where there's, let's say it this way, in healthy democracies, the state and the ruling party are independent, but in contexts in which they become the same, there's a risk that these tools can be leveraged to a much greater scale. And so I just want to give two brief examples. So here we have an official government Facebook page that has been merged with the campaign page. And I think this topic of how a political campaign can come to subsume the state's presence or image is very much in line with this topic of how the presence of an online sphere or how the collection of data can be used to maintain power versus being used to acquire power. Here is another brief excerpt from our country study in Malaysia. In Malaysia, what we found was that the government had access to the state's poverty database, and they were using information on households that were getting welfare money and going to them and saying, knocking on their doors and saying, don't forget your brother got a wheelchair from the government, or your brother was in the hospital for a number of days in a state-run hospital. You should probably continue to vote for the party if you want your family to continue receiving these benefits. I think the government has access to a certain set of data that no one else does in a day and age in which data is being used to make political decisions. Access to that data can be exploited to maintain power, not just using data to acquire power. But when you have it, like when you're the government, how can you abuse your access to data to make sure that you stay in power? So in this way, I think big tech in some ways, particularly in the way it's used in technology, is kind of this natural extension of big oil, big finance, and now big tech. And in fact, the political digital industry is in fact a global industry. And people often think, Cambridge Analytica is the only company involved in the space. My colleagues and I have identified over 300 such companies around the world. And here's just screenshots of many of their homepages here. And in line with being a massive industry, I think industrial level resources are being kind of pumped into the space. And so there are industrial level resources being pumped into the space. And I think you can see this from the amount of money entering the space, but you can also see it from the way companies talk about how much data they have. Here's a screenshot of a company from the US, L2, saying that they have access to 190 million voter records. Here's a screenshot from a company called i360 that's run by the Koch brothers, if you're familiar with them, explaining how they have data on 290 plus million consumers with over 700 plus data points, presumably on each of those consumers. Political data, this is another screenshot from a company, AirSubtle, the one that we were just talking about. Here they have a blog post, a 204 million person voter file just grew more precise with modeling capabilities. And it's an industry that has many of the same logics that other industries have. It's for profit. It's not necessarily pro-democratic. It's more concerned with efficiency and questions of effectiveness, like does it work, than it is about whether it's preserving or advancing democratic principles. And so I thought I'd just share a little bit of the backstory of one company, Cambridge Analytica, to demonstrate this point of the logic from which these sorts of companies are coming. This is a photo of Nigel Oakes. He started a group called the Behavioral Dynamics Institute that ended up becoming the Strategic Communications Lab. That was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. And he believed that advertising was inefficient for mass opinion shifts for social change. Before Cambridge Analytica started its work on political campaigns around the world in about 20 different countries, they worked with armies. And Nigel Oakes himself has said, we use the same techniques as Aristotle and Hitler. We appeal to people on an emotional level to get them to agree on a functional level. Alexander Nix, who we just watched a video of, said persuading someone to vote in a certain way is really very similar to persuading a 14 to 25-year-old boy in Indonesia to not join Al-Qaeda. One of the main points I want to make is that I don't think you'll be surprised to many people on this talk that we live in this time of surveillance capitalism where everything we do is data that's valuable to be captured because it's information that might contain a valuable insight, whether that's insight that can be used to make money, or in this case, whether that's insight that can contain something that reveals your political views or beliefs or persuasions. And perhaps surveillance capitalism is really a precursor to surveillance politics, in which all data is political data. And for me, I think that this is a very important issue because without a functioning political system, take any issue you care about, whether it's the environment or holding democratic principles or it's wealth inequality or whatever, if we have a political system that's run by a logic that runs the for-profit sector as well, we risk eroding our democratic principles. And without a functioning political system, of course, progress on any of the issues that we care about is virtually impossible.
What I wonder is, what I asked in my writing is, can it, to what extent in today's world, say within today and 5 years, can a data-driven the political campaign can win and be ethical at the same time, right? Since we cannot escape a big data in this foreseeable future of the century. And you're going to say company that is dealing with such an approach?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think it's a great question. Thanks, Viad. And, this is one that I've asked myself a lot. I mentioned that I sort of started my career in Silicon Valley. I believe that there are potential democratic benefits that many of these technologies have. And it's not at all the case that simply using data means that what you're doing is democratically problematic. I think it is absolutely possible for a data-driven political campaign to be successful and ethical at the same time. For me, this depends really on the how. It really depends on the details. I think one of the challenges of the fact that this space has become such an industry is that there are a lot of companies who have entered it, and obviously in the interest of making money. I mentioned in my 2018 talk in Tbilisi that we've seen companies like Snapchat, companies that have nothing to do with politics originally, enter the political space because now they have political entities who are willing to pay them for insights. And we also see the other way around, companies that originally were formed for political purposes then extend to other domains. But I think one of the challenges so many companies entering the space is that so much of political communication now has become a trade secret. So much of it is a black box that can't be analyzed or open to scrutiny. And it's as if the political decision-making process, here in a healthy political system and healthy democracy, I should say, candidate A, the success of candidate A versus the success of candidate B should be solely the strength of their messages to the voters. Now, what's happening, because there's so much money to be made from using the latest and greatest targeting strategy, is that those targeting strategies are not open to scrutiny, are not open to being analyzed. And so I think one example of how a data-driven campaign can win and be ethical at the same time is unlikely to come from a company if they have if they're working on behalf of a certain political client. I think one of the best examples is if you have, for example, a nonpartisan group that's using these techniques to increase voter turnout, for example. This is, I think, a great way in which these techniques and this data can be used in a pro-democratic way that's open to scrutiny, assuming that this organization is transparent about how they're doing it. I think a lot of companies are not willing to talk about their methods because they're trade secrets, because this is where they generate value from. And I think this is, I think it is absolutely possible to run an ethical, winning campaign. It's just the context in which it occurs. That if the approach is going to be a black box, I think it's difficult to say if it's ethical or not. This is obviously a huge topic. I just had enough time and space to sort of just get to the tip of the iceberg, but don't hesitate to shoot me an email, varoon@technicaltech.org. I don't really tweet often, but if you're interested, feel free to follow me. And perhaps once in a blue moon when I do tweet, you will get updated on it. And that's a QR code to our the Tactical Tech website. Thank you so much.